Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the videos you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to deconversion and atheist issues and any issue related to those issues. Today I want to continue on my deconversion story series. This is part 4. I'm going to probably call this Faith of My Father. Last time I kind of left off with the idea that there was a significant tragic event that kind of kept my faith going. And if you haven't guessed already or aren't familiar with my story, it was on October 5th, 1994, I received a phone call at seminary, because I was at seminary at the time, from my mother, who told me that my dad had died rather suddenly. I had seen him 2 days before. I was home for the weekend from seminary, and he gave me a hug, told me he loved me, and that he said, make sure you travel safe. And so his last words, I don't, have any negative thing with the parting or anything like that. It was just, 2 days before they had been telling me that he was having trouble keeping his blood pressure under control. It was kind of bobbing all over the place, and turns out he had a heart condition, and that was kind of the end of it. How did that keep me in the faith? Well, you got to go back a little ways. When I was a little boy, much littler, about 4 or 5, my dad gave his heart to Jesus. And so now I understand what that was now. My parents had been, shall we say, a very much different type of couple before they became religious. And I think the event that caused them to become more religious was me. Before I was born, they were, just a happy couple. They had no other children, and they would have no other children, just me. And so they kind of lived their life the way they wanted to. My mom was a career woman. My dad worked in the factory. They just had a good life together. They had a lot of fun, and they didn't really become religious until my mom became religious pretty shortly after I was born. And then my dad became religious later when I was old enough to kind of understand. My dad credited, for instance, turning to Jesus for his ability to stop smoking, stop drinking so much. I now understand what that is. It's what I would call an addiction shift. Okay, you shift their way of doing things from one way to something else, but that something else is more socially acceptable. Okay. And you accredit the significance of that to some supernatural thing, but really all it is you're getting the endorphin release from something else. And my parents switched from being, nominal Christians. My mother had been in the Assemblies of God before, and then both my parents became Assemblies of God people, so they both became Pentecostal. And the Pentecostal experiential nature started, I think, to stimulate those endorphin centers of their brain. But my dad credited, Jesus and the Holy Spirit for getting rid of a lot of his bad habits. Now, my father was dyslexic, so we didn't discover that until near his death either, but he always had a hard time reading. So from a biblical standpoint, he couldn't really read the Bible that well, so he was completely reliant on what preachers told him and everything else. Now, that said, he was a great guy. I have no complaints. In fact, I consider myself very fortunate to have him as a father and my mother as a mother. We grew up, we called each other, we were nicknamed the Three Musketeers, each one of us taking a role. Dad was the fun one, so he became Porthos, and Mom was the religious one, so she became Aramis, and I was Athos, okay, the tragic noble falling in love and having his heart broken. And boy, did that become somewhat prophetic, I suppose. But there was that kind of relationship. I was more I was as much a friend with my parents as I grew up as I was their child. And we just had a great life together. I was never really that disobedient. I was a pretty good kid. Um, and most of that was just pleasing my parents. I wanted to make them happy about me. And so I had a good relationship, grew up in the church, and my dad was instrumental in that. And so we became very close. Okay, I could talk to my dad about anything. We hunted together. It's interesting that after his death, I haven't been hunting since. That was kind of my thing with me and my dad. Still don't have any moral objections to hunting, by the way, but I do, I don't, on a personal level, enjoy it near as much as I did when we did it together. So that's just kind of one of those things that fell by the wayside because of Dad. But although I still maintain a lot of love for sports, and taking the occasional hike, which is right from my father, just taking a walk. And so my parents raised me to be Pentecostal. They were good people. But also they were still very much, because they hadn't been in the faith, they had come into it, they still had some old things that they taught me. Like my mother and father, didn't have a problem with certain secular music like my denomination did. They wanted to just get rid of all the Christian rock and roll and everything else. And over the years, I just grew closer and closer with my dad. And then when I became a father, I became even closer because I would talk to him all the time. Like, well, how do you be a better dad? And me and my dad would have these conversations about how to be a better dad. And he would say, well, I only really have one shot at this. So I says, well, you did a pretty good job. So, tell me what's going on. And as each one of my kids was born, he, of course, fell in love with them. When my daughter was born, I felt very sure that had he lived, my daughter would have been the most spoiled little girl ever, thanks to my father. But it was just one of those things where I just grew very close, very attached. He was my best friend, okay? And so his death, of course, had an extreme emotional effect on me. And looking back at it now through the lens of autism and things like that, I think his death, from an emotional point of view, just overloaded my nervous system. I would spend the next 2.5 years depressed, pretty much. And people go, well, how did that keep you in the faith? My father was very devout, although we had some conversations where I think he was starting to express some doubts himself. My mother has always been devout, but he was more the guy that came into it later. He kind of credited it to getting rid of his bad habits, but later on, not so much. I don't know. It's strange to look back at it, and it's a little bit hard to look back at it because I loved him so much. And so at the funeral, the pastor at the time, just said, Ed, just stay on the straight and narrow and you'll see him again. And boy, did that stick with me. The emotional state I was in of wanting to hug my father one more time, to just be with him again, to hear his voice, to feel his hugs, to have some advice. That emotional desire, and then coupled with that simple statement, probably dominated me for the next 15 years of, probably more, probably 25 years, pretty much. 15, 20. I started to live my life as a pastor. Now remember, as I was coming out of seminary, I had all these doubts from an intellectual, academic point of view as to whether or not faith was even real. But now I had this emotional foundation of what this was about. And so I wanted to see my father again. I wanted to hug him again. I wanted to be with him again. And in order to do that, I had, according to my faith, to stay faithful, do the things that I needed to do. So the intellectual stuff, the academic stuff, kind of took a back burner to just being a Christian and living the life. And I'm going to talk about my ministry in other videos, and I don't know if this particular video is going to be that long. other than to say at this point, I just started living the Christian life even more devoutly so that I would see my Father again. It became the emotional underpinning of everything I did as far as my personal faith. And so it's this notion of being able to see your loved ones again that really hinged with me. What a great promise, huh? Where you could meet somebody and make it right, or say those words that you forgot to say at the last minute, so on and so forth. And you just don't have that opportunity to do that. And so there's an emotional thing that religion taps into. And it's, it's that fear of death. It's all of that stuff that kind of taps into that. Regrets. I didn't really have any regrets in my father's relationship. I just had a strong desire to see him again. And this went on for years. And every time I would have my doubts, I would have this emotional battle with myself where my intellect is saying, this is bullshit. But my emotions are saying, yeah, but you want to see your dad again. And because of my love for my father, that won out far more than the intellectual. But then, I don't know, it was probably 15 years after his death, maybe 20, that I began to realize that no matter what I desired, no matter what emotional desire that I had, the truth was going to be the truth. Whatever was real was going to be real. So I may never see my father again if none of this faith stuff is real. And I had serious doubts by this time. I was, throwing away a lot of doctrines. My ministry had taken several shuffles. At that point, I was going through seminary. And then later on, I had some ministry trials, which I'll talk about in the next video. But I got to a point where I shifted from being a denominational pastor to being independent and taking over a congregational church. And it was in these moments that I began to self-reflect on the emotional side of my faith of wanting to see my dad again. And a thought struck me that no matter how much I wanted that, maybe that wasn't reality and I was never going to get there. I couldn't prove that that was what was going to happen. So I eventually shifted gears and I said, you know what? I don't know if that's going to be real. And the emotional underpinnings of my faith began to diminish quite a bit. And I began to think about Dad. Dad, as faithful as Dad was, he was also a very pragmatic guy. And in the end, he was kind of expressing some of his own doubts about certain aspects of the faith. And I don't know, had he lived, if he would still be a person of faith or not. So I don't know. So it's kind of like, I love my father, I'm very thankful for him, but I began to realize that I had lived a lot of my life on my own, and now a lot of my emotional underpinning was other things. At the time, I was still very much in love with my wife. I had 3 wonderful kids that were all grown up, but I thought, one of the theological things that I began to question was God's goodness when it came to death. Because you get the line, well, God is taking them on, he wants the best in heaven and all this other crap. You hear that a lot at the funeral of children, oh, well, God saw this wonderful flower and picked it, or whatever excuse. And my response to that now is, God is timeless according to Christian theology. Why would it matter to him to pick something, quote unquote, early? Because early and later don't mean anything to that God. When you are timeless, none of that. He could literally wait until we all turned to 120, then took us, all at the same time. And then we would all know how much more time we had with this person. He doesn't have to take them away from us. It seems kind of selfish on his part. And then we got to live this life of, okay, we got to stay faithful. It's kind of a nice little game that this whole theology plays with your head, isn't it? And eventually I began to say, well, if God exists, he's an asshole for taking people early and leaving us without him, when we could use them in our temporal existence, and then all of us could be there together at the same time. And it just, after a while, the theology just broke down and it just doesn't make any sense to me anymore. And so with the emotional underpinnings of my father gone, the intellectual side began to kick back in. As soon as I became a congregational pastor, the next 6 years of this cycle of I don't have this emotional underpinning with my dad anymore, and now I'm bringing up the intellectual stuff, and I'm preaching on different topics. I'm writing on my one blog called All Things Rabyd. If you go to that blog, I think it's still there. I check on it every once in a while. It is literally, you could read, if you start at the beginning chronologically, you can start to see my theological questioning in that blog. That's why I probably leave it up. Every once in a while I want to check, when the hell did I think about that? And things like that. So you'll see me struggling, okay, and trying to fix the theology all the time. And part of it is the grief over my dad. And afterlife, all that stuff, I just began to really question it all. And eventually, of course, if you've already heard part of the story, that I eventually, it was a theological question on sin that basically said, sin doesn't really exist. It's a made-up problem with a made-up solution. And once I got to that point, became a deist for a year, but I kind of owe R and Ra for getting out of that, because I watched his systematic classification of life series back then, I think. I don't know if it existed, but I think he was starting it or something to that effect. He did something, and I looked him up and I started watching it. And I suddenly began to realize that you don't need a guiding force for any of this. It does it all by itself. It's kind of cool, actually. And so I dropped that, became an atheist, and been an atheist for 2 years. And then left the church, which I'll talk about later, how that was not such the greatest thing. And so this ghost of my father was constantly there for a long time, and it kept fading and fading and fading until it was gone. And I remember after leaving the church, the first time me and my mother took a trip to the graveside, we'd take this pilgrimage around Father's Day every year to clean up the grave and plant new flowers and things like that at Dad's grave. And before, it had always been a time where I just talked to Dad. But that time, immediately after that, it must have been, 2016 probably, somewhere in there. No, I left the church. No, it was about 2019. I stood in front of his grave. Mom had gone back to the car, and I just wanted to stand there. I think my mother thought I was just talking to Dad some more. But I wasn't. I was staring at his grave and realizing he was gone. And I had a good short cry, and suddenly a tremendous burden lifted off my shoulders, and I suddenly realized I had let him go. That I had finally had closure. All those years of not having closure to my father's death because of this religious belief stuff. And I feel so much infinitely better since. Because now I can put my father's death into a great context, and any memory I have of him is even more precious than it was before, because I realize I'm not going to make any more. Okay, and I need to hold on to the ones that are precious to me and let the ones that are nonsense go, and just realize he was a great man despite his religion, and he was a good man despite his religion at times. And sometimes he would let things go because he felt it was more important to be real than to be faithful. And so that kind of opened the door for me, because I began to ask myself the question, would he still be a man of faith today? I'm not so sure. So I finally let go. And it's been a wonderful thing. Grieving is a long process, and the faith thing made it longer with my father. Both the grieving process was longer, but I held on to my faith probably a lot longer than I should have, because I knew intellectually there was a lot of problems, but I put them off and backburnered them. And I was in the ministry, so I couldn't really deal with doubts. I had to be the man of faith. And I'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. But at this point, I can now say that I've laid my father to rest. I have closure over him. I still visit his grave once a year. And but that's an emotional thing. That's me reconnecting. And it's good. It's good. I finally have accepted his death. Still sucks every year, but I've accepted it. And so that's kind of, I wanted to put that out there because this is the significant event, a turning point from me having doubts to starting to fight to continue to have faith. And that will go on for many years until such time as I let it up. Probably next time I'll talk more about post my father's death and getting into the ministry. We'll talk more about that, how I began to start to fulfill the call of God. It's kind of a sad story in some respects, so we'll do that. But I think I'm going to stop it right here. I just wanted everybody to understand how deeply a single tragic emotional event can keep you in the faith despite your best up here, your best thinking. So sometimes a lot of times we do things because of passion, not because of reason. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that as we continue our walk. Well, thank you for stopping by. I appreciate every one of you. I hope this has been somewhat helpful as I share my story. I hope it's helping you walk through some things that are similar in your life. Always make sure to live your best life. I think this whole story has reminded me of how important it is to make sure we're pursuing what's best for us, the good life for us, and as happy as possible, because you only get one go around and then it's over. And make sure it's a good one. Thank you once again for stopping by. I appreciate every single one of you, and I'll see you next time.